This is the map they swore would never look like this. For 70 years, the United States Navy has maintained what defense planners call freedom of navigation, the operational doctrine that says American warships can sail anywhere on Earth, deter any adversary, and guarantee the safe passage of the global commerce that flows through the world's critical maritime choke points. The Carrier Strike Group was the physical embodiment of that guarantee. It was the answer to every crisis, the punctuation mark at the end of every diplomatic ultimatum. We have sent 2 carrier groups to the region was not a statement about ships. It was a statement about who controlled the water. But this morning, Wednesday, April 9, 2026, at approximately 0700 hours Eastern Time, minus the maritime tracking feeds that defense analysts and shipping industry professionals watch in real time told a story that rewrites that 70-year assumption. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the 20-mile-wide choke point at the southern entrance to the Red Sea, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal and onward to the Mediterranean, a corridor through which approximately $1 trillion in global trade transits every year, is effectively closed to Western commercial traffic for the 3rd consecutive week. Not because a hurricane blocked it, not because a grounded container ship sealed it, as the Ever Given did in the Suez in 2021, because a non-state actor operating from mud brick command posts in the Yemeni highlands has made the transit cost prohibitive. The insurance market has collapsed for the route, and for the first time in the post-World War II era, the United States Navy, the most powerful maritime force ever, assembled, is unable to restore freedom of passage for the ships that carry the goods sustaining the global economy. This is not a temporary disruption. This is a structural collapse of the maritime security architecture that has underwritten global prosperity since 1945. And it happened faster, more completely, and more cheaply than any scenario in any classified war game predicted. Buckle up, because what follows is the full account of how the most important trade route in the world slipped out of American control, what it costs every single day it stays that way, and what the loss of this corridor means for your grocery bill, your pension fund, and the credibility of American power in every theater on Earth. Here is what you need to understand before we trace exactly how this happened. The Red Sea corridor is not one of several important shipping lanes. It is the spinal column of the global trading system, as currently constructed. Here are the numbers, and every one of them matters. Approximately 15% of all global maritime trade, roughly $1 trillion in goods per year, transits the Red Sea and Suez Canal. That includes 12% of all seaborne oil, 8% of all liquefied natural gas, and an estimated 30% of global container shipping, the cargo boxes that carry the electronics, clothing, automotive parts, pharmaceuticals, and consumer goods that stock the shelves of every retailer in the United States and Europe. On a daily basis, we are talking about approximately $3 billion in commercial value moving through a corridor that is 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, the Bab el-Mandeb, and overlooked on one side by Yemen, a country that has been in a state of civil war since 2015. The alternative route for ships that cannot transit the Red Sea is around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That diversion adds approximately 3,500 miles to the journey from Asia to Europe, roughly 10 to 14 additional days of sailing time, and somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in additional fuel and operational costs per voyage for a global shipping industry that moves approximately 11 billion tons of cargo per year. The math of systematic diversion is not merely inconvenient, it is inflationary, destabilizing, and at the volume of traffic currently being rerouted, a structural tax on the entire global economy estimated by the International Monetary Fund at $56 billion per year in direct additional costs, before accounting for the second-order effects on supply chains, inventory management, and consumer prices. To understand why the Navy cannot simply solve this problem the way it has solved every maritime security crisis since the Korean War, you have to understand what has changed in the technical and operational landscape of the Bab el-Mandeb. The Houthi movement, formerly known as Ansar Allah, the Yemen-based militia backed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, began its campaign against Red Sea shipping in October 2023, following the outbreak of the Gaza conflict. In the 18 months since, that campaign has evolved through 4 distinct operational generations, and the current 4th generation capability represents something that the U.S. Navy has never faced from a non-state actor in the entire history of American naval power. Generation 1, October through December 2023, consisted of Iranian-supplied anti-ship ballistic missiles and long-range drones fired at Israeli-affiliated vessels, impressive in its ambition, relatively limited in its volume and precision, and met with effective counterfire from U.S. destroyers using SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors. Generation 2, January through June 2024, added one-way attack drones and subsonic cruise missiles, escalating the volume of attacks and beginning to strain the interceptor magazines of the destroyer fleet. Generation 3, July through December 2024, introduced maritime drone boats, remotely controlled explosive-laden speedboats, as a complementary attack vector, simultaneously taxing the Navy's surface and subsurface threat response systems. Generation 4, January 2026, to present coordinated multi-vector swarm attacks combining ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, aerial drones, and maritime surface drones launched simultaneously from multiple geographic positions. Designed to overwhelm the engagement capacity of any single U.S. warship or task force, it is this fourth generation that has achieved what the previous three could not: the effective operational denial of the corridor, not through any single catastrophic success, but through the sustained cumulative imposition of unacceptable risk. The financial mechanism through which the Houthis achieved effective control of the Bab el-Mandeb without sinking a single major warship is the insurance market. And this is the dimension of the crisis that is almost entirely invisible in the mainstream coverage. Here is how it works. Commercial shipping operates on marine cargo insurance policies that cover hull damage, cargo loss, and third-party liability for vessels transiting high-risk zones. Those policies require additional war risk premium endorsements, supplemental coverage that reflects the probability of hostile action. In the Red Sea corridor before October 2023, the war risk premium for a standard container ship transit was approximately $500 per voyage. By March 2024, following the escalation to Generation 2 attacks, that premium had risen to $150,000 per voyage. By December 2024, after the first successful strikes on vessels that were not Israeli affiliated, it had reached $600,000 per voyage. As of April 2026, following the Generation 4 swarm campaign, Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee, the institution that effectively sets the global benchmark for maritime war, risk pricing, have designated the entire Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and Bab el-Mandeb corridor as a high-risk area, and the war risk premium for a standard transit has reached $1.8 million per voyage. For a voyage that generates $2.1 million in gross freight revenue, a $1.8 million insurance cost makes the transit economically irrational. The ships are not being sunk. They are being priced off the route. The Houthis did not need to defeat the U.S. Navy in battle. They needed only to make the insurance actuaries conclude that the probability and cost of damage exceeded the commercial value of the passage. So they have achieved that the route is economically closed. Nobody is adequately explaining the interceptor magazine crisis that lies at the operational heart of why the Navy cannot simply shoot its way to a solution. Here is the technical reality that sources inside the Chief of Naval Operations Staff describe with barely concealed alarm. The primary naval surface combatants deployed to the Red Sea Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers carry between 90 and 96 vertical launch system cells. Those cells contain a mix of missiles, SM-2 and SM-6 air defense interceptors, Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and ASROC anti-submarine rockets. The exact mix is classified, but the unclassified estimate from naval analysts is that fully loaded Arleigh Burke carries approximately 40 to 50 air defense interceptors at any given time. Each SM-2 costs $2.1 million. Each SM-6 costs $4.3 million. A Generation 4 Houthi swarm attack, combining ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and aerial drones in a single coordinated salvo, can require the expenditure of 8 to 15 interceptors to defeat completely. The USS Carney, one of the destroyers that bore the brunt of the early campaign, reportedly expended more air defense missiles in a single month of Red Sea operations than the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet expended in all of 2022. The magazine depletes. The destroyer must return to port for reloading. There is currently one facility in the entire theater, the naval base at Bahrain, with the capacity and the inventory to conduct a full vertical launch system reload. And the reloading process takes between 3 and 5 days. During those days, the destroyer is not defending the corridor. Sources inside Naval Sea Systems Command describe the current destroyer rotation schedule in the Red Sea as a, quote, treadmill that is running faster than we can walk. The Navy is not losing battles. It is losing the logistical sustainability contest against an adversary that produces its weapons for $2,000 each and stores them in dispersed, hardened positions throughout Yemen that have proven largely impervious to the airstrikes the United States and United Kingdom have conducted since January 2024. We're talking about more than 700 airstrikes across 18 months that have, according to sources familiar with the battle damage assessment process, reduced Houthi attack capacity by an estimated 15 to 20%. It gets worse. The global supply chain consequences of the Bab el-Mandeb closure are only now beginning to manifest in the consumer price data that ordinary Americans actually feel. The rerouting of shipping around the Cape of Good Hope adds 10 to 14 days to transit times from Asian manufacturing centers to European and East Coast American ports. In a just-in-time supply chain architecture, the inventory management model adopted by virtually every major retailer and manufacturer over the past 30 years, specifically because the reliable, low-cost transit through the Suez Corridor made it economically optimal. A 10 to 14-day disruption is not a minor inconvenience. It is a structural shock. Retailers who carry 3 weeks of inventory now find themselves at risk of stockouts. Manufacturers running assembly lines calibrated to parts arriving on specific dates find themselves halting production because a single component shipped from a single supplier in South Korea or Vietnam is stuck on a vessel making a long way around Africa. Sources inside the National Retail Federation describe current inventory disruption levels as comparable to the worst months of the COVID-19 supply chain collapse in 2021. But with a crucial difference. In 2021, the disruption was broadly understood as temporary and pandemic-driven. The current disruption is geopolitical, structurally reinforced, and has no visible resolution timeline. The consumer price implications are already appearing in the February 2026 CPI data. Shipping-intensive goods, electronics, clothing, furniture, and automotive parts showed price increases of 3.2 to 4.7% month over month. Against an overall CPI increase of 0.6% for the same period, the inflation is not general, it is targeted, structural, and compounding. Let's examine the geopolitical dimension that makes this crisis qualitatively different from every previous Red Sea incident, including the 1984 tanker war and the 2021 Ever Given grounding. The critical distinction is this. For the first time, the closure of a major maritime choke point is being sustained not by a peer competitor state with the military capacity to challenge American naval power directly, but by a non-state actor with an ideological commitment that is immune to the deterrence calculus that has governed great power maritime competition since the end of the Second World War. Traditional deterrence rests on the logic of cost. Imposition. You threaten to impose costs on an adversary that exceed the value of whatever objective they are pursuing. An irrational adversary adjusts its behavior accordingly. The Houthi leadership, and this assessment is shared across the intelligence community, according to sources briefed on the relevant national intelligence estimates, does not operate within a conventional cost-benefit framework. They have absorbed more than 700 airstrikes. They have lost senior commanders, and they have experienced significant civilian casualties in their operating areas, and their response has been to accelerate their missile and drone production program, expand their operational range to include targets in the Indian Ocean 1,800 miles from Yemen, and publicly celebrate each successful strike as a religious and political victory that reinforces their domestic legitimacy. Deterrence is not working because deterrence requires a rational actor who places survival above ideology. The Houthis have demonstrated consistently and at scale that they do not. The worst case scenario is not the one that makes the most noise in the media coverage. It is not a single catastrophic strike on a major container ship, though sources say that probability is assessed at 35% within the next 90 days. The worst case scenario is the slow, grinding continuation of exactly what is already happening. The sustained economic pressure of a permanently elevated war risk premium, compounding supply chain disruption, and gradual erosion of confidence in American security guarantees among the Asian and European trading partners whose economic behavior the entire architecture of the dollar-denominated global trading system depends upon. Here is a specific second-order threat that sources inside the Treasury Department's Office of International Affairs describe as the most alarming medium-term consequence of the Red Sea closure. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and several other Gulf states have been engaged since 2023 in active discussions with China about the possibility of denominating a portion of their oil exports in yuan rather than dollars. The petrodollar arrangement that has underpinned dollar reserve currency status since the Nixon-Kissinger agreement with Riyadh in 1974. The credibility of American security guarantees in the Gulf is the primary structural argument against those states making that transition. An American Navy that cannot secure the Bab el-Mandeb against a Yemeni militia is not providing the level of security assurance that justifies the political cost of maintaining the petrodollar relationship. If Saudi Arabia moves even 15% of its oil export invoicing to yuan, the demand shock to the dollar and the corresponding supply shock to us. Treasury bond prices would dwarf the direct economic cost of the Red Sea disruption itself. We are talking about a scenario in which a $2,000 Houthi drone launched from a rusted pickup truck in the Yemeni highlands triggers a sequence of events that ends the 70-year era of dollar supremacy. That is not hyperbole. That is the specific causal chain that Treasury economists are currently modeling. The historical resonance of this moment is not subtle, and it demands to be stated directly. The British Empire lost control of the Suez Canal in 956, not militarily, but politically. When American financial pressure forced a British and French withdrawal from the Suez intervention and demonstrated conclusively that the British could no longer project power in the Middle East without American consent, that moment is regarded by historians as the definitive end of the British imperial era, the point at which the gap between formal military capability and actual strategic authority became too large to paper over. The United States is now experiencing a structurally analogous moment, though the mechanism is different and the adversary is, on paper, far weaker. The formal military capability remains overwhelming. The strategic authority, the ability to translate that capability into actual security outcomes, is being visibly, publicly, and expensively eroded by an adversary that costs roughly $40 million per year to arm and sustain. The lesson the watching world is drawing from this, and sources inside the State Department's policy planning staff describe this explicitly in their internal assessments, is not that the American military has been defeated. It is that American military power has a cost threshold above which it will not be applied. And that cost threshold can be identified, calibrated, and systematically exploited by any actor willing to accept a degree of punishment that Washington is not willing to impose. That lesson, once learned, is extraordinarily difficult to unlearn. It will inform the strategic calculations of every revisionist actor in Beijing, in Moscow, in Tehran, in Pyongyang for the next decade. The founders of American foreign policy as a coherent strategic discipline, figures like George Marshall, Dean Aikson, and Paul Nitze understood something that the current crisis reveals has been partially forgotten inside the institutions. They built credibility in international security is not stockpiled like weapons or accumulated like GDP. It is a live variable constantly being assessed and reassessed by every actor in the system based on the most recent observable evidence of will and capability. The Marshall Plan was not merely an economic program. It was a credibility investment, a demonstration that the United States would bear sustained costs to protect the international order it had built at the price of 400,000 American lives. The current administration's response to the Red Sea closure has been, by any objective assessment, a credibility withdrawal. The strikes on Houthi infrastructure have been real but insufficient. The diplomatic effort to reconstitute a naval coalition comparable to Operation Earnest, with the 1987 reflagging operation that kept the Persian Gulf open during the Iran-Iraq war, has not materialized at the scale required. And the fundamental mismatch between the cost of the American response and the cost of the Houthi attack has not been resolved by any policy currently in implementation. And the route remains closed, and the insurance market remains collapsed. And every morning that the maritime tracking feeds show the Bab el-Mandeb effectively empty of Western commercial traffic is another data point in the global credibility ledger, being recorded and interpreted in capitals from Beijing to Brussels. Watch the Lloyd's of London War Risk Premium Quarterly Report, which is the single most objective measure of whether the security situation in the Red Sea is improving or deteriorating, more reliable than any official statement. because the actuaries have no political incentive to be optimistic. Watch the Suez Canal Authority's monthly transit statistics, which will show in real terms whether commercial traffic is beginning to return to the corridor or continuing to divert around Africa. Watch the February and March 2026 US CPI subcategory data for imported goods, specifically electronics, apparel, and automotive parts, for the first measurable consumer price signal of the rerouting tax. Watch for any diplomatic movement on a reconstituted naval coalition in the Gulf of Aden, and specifically whether Saudi Arabia, which has the most to lose from Houthi regional dominance, is willing to provide basing and logistical support for a sustained counter-campaign rather than simply absorbing the attacks as a manageable cost of doing business with Washington. And watch the yuan-denominated oil contract volumes published monthly by the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, because that number, more than any military metric, will tell you whether the strategic consequences of the Red Sea closure are beginning to cascade into the currency and financial architecture that constitutes America's deepest source of global power. The U.S. Navy did not lose a battle in the Bab el-Mandeb. It lost something harder to recover: the presumption of inevitability. The presumption that American maritime power applied at sufficient scale would always be enough to restore order. And that presumption is gone, and the map this morning looks different than it has looked in 70 years. Subscribe, because the next chapter of the story is being written right now in the shipping lanes, the insurance markets, and the finance ministries of every nation, watching to see what America does next.